Hello. On this episode of Writing Notes, I'm going to talk to you about the three types of rhetoric that Aristotle sort of categorizes all arguments into. This is what's called political or deliberative or legislative rhetoric, forensic rhetoric, and epideictic or ceremonial rhetoric. So these are, for Aristotle, the three main types of arguments that people make. And what we're going to talk about today is the ways in which these three different types of rhetoric move. So to start with political rhetoric, and again, this is also called deliberative or legislative rhetoric. This is rhetoric that's primarily concerned with what should be done in the future and why. So this is, in fact, what we often think about in terms of politics is, what are we going to do? Why are we going to do it? What's the best course of action? How do we achieve our goals? And things like this. This is all political rhetoric. So, to give us an example, one issue that's very contemporary right now in the U.S. and that's very important and that's very hotly debated is gun control. Different people obviously have very strong views on this, very divided views, very opposing, polarized views. But this is an area where we often see political rhetoric in action. So, for instance, those who are in favor of gun control, increased gun control, will establish a particular goal. For instance, we want to largely end mass shootings in the U.S. And then where we have political rhetoric is when we say, here is the argument for how we get to that point. So in order to get to that point, we should increase the requirements for background checks. We should make it illegal for civilians to own assault weapons, even the civilian custom versions of them. We should maybe limit the amount of ammunition that someone can buy, etc., etc. Whatever points are being made here. The idea here is that these are techniques that we can use. These are things that this argument claims we can do, things that we can enact in order to achieve our particular goal. So that's political rhetoric, fairly straightforward. Thinking instead about forensic rhetoric, we have rhetoric that moves sort of in the opposite direction. So if political rhetoric is, here's what we should do going forward, forensic rhetoric looks backwards. And is primarily concerned with the justice or injustice of actions that have occurred in the past. So a lot of times in sort of public discourse, common discourse, we think of the term forensics as being associated with law enforcement, with judicial proceedings and things like this. And that's actually pretty spot on for the way that forensic rhetoric works. So we would often have, legal cases would be the sort of example par excellence of this, where one side is arguing that, for instance, this crime has not been committed by the defendant. This defendant either is actively innocent or for whatever reason there were mitigating circumstances that made that action just, that made that action legal or acceptable. And then on the other side you have the prosecution who argues, no, this person has violated the laws, they have broken our social codes, and so they must be punished. And that's that twist there at the end. This is actually where we get into the slightly political side of legal cases. So that's actually really quite an interesting example in part because one of the things it illustrates is that, like the rhetorical appeals and like the rhetorical methods of development and all of these components of rhetoric, we rarely have things in their pure form. So if we're thinking again in terms of the law case, so say we have someone who's accused of stealing a car. The defense obviously argues that he or she didn't do it. The prosecution argues that he or she did do it, and the implication of both of these arguments being the thing that has happened in the past was unjust or was just. So just if you're the defense counsel, unjust if you're the prosecutor. And then again, this gives us a really interesting point, because when the argument pivots from guilty, not guilty, to sentencing, then we move into the sphere of political rhetoric. We're saying this person who's now convicted must serve a 10-year sentence. That is the only way that justice can be done. Or the jury must exonerate this person on the strength of the evidence. That's the only way that justice can be done. This is forward-looking, as opposed to the sort of backward-looking, evaluative quality of forensic rhetoric. And then the third, if we're thinking of this in sort of the spatialized terms of forward-looking and backward-looking, the third type of rhetoric, which is ceremonial rhetoric, or epideictic rhetoric, is the term that Aristotle uses, I believe. We could think of this as sort of lateral. So essentially, ceremonial rhetoric is rhetoric that praises or blames, rhetoric that honors or critiques. And to a certain extent, this is going to be tied up with forensic rhetoric, because it will typically be looking back, but it's looking back not with the interest of establishing the justice or injustice of a thing that has happened. It's looking for models to be emulated or models to be avoided. So what's now a slightly dated example of this, but this is one that I used for years in my classes. In, I want to say like 2012 or so, maybe it was earlier than that, but at one point Miley Cyrus did a performance at the VMAs, the Video Music Awards. I think that's what VMAs is. I'm not a pop culture person. But Miley Cyrus did a VMAs performance, which was, somewhat sexually explicit, and I think there were some sort of questionable racial elements or something. I don't really remember it all that well. But the point is not the performance itself in terms of ceremonial rhetoric. The point in terms of ceremonial rhetoric is precisely that there's almost immediately two competing strands of discourse about this performance. One strand was critical of the performance, largely based on what we call slut-shaming, which is basically, Miley Cyrus shouldn't be all sexualized, and she was a hero to my daughter during her childhood, and now she's out, I don't know, dancing with giant penises or whatever on national television, and all of this stuff, very critical stuff, and so this is the sort of negative approach to ceremonial rhetoric, which is rhetoric that blames, rhetoric that censures. But then on the other hand, you had a lot of people who came out very strongly in favor of Cyrus's performance. People who were saying, this is a sort of liberatory feminist performance, this is about taking control of one's own sexuality, taking control of one's identity, challenging gender norms, a lot of comparisons to people like Lady Gaga and to a certain extent, Katy Perry and things like this. So this was the other side of ceremonial rhetoric, which is the side that praises, or that holds up particular behavior, a particular person, group, idea, whatever it is, as worthy of emulation. So in that instance, we had two very sort of strongly popular competing strands of ceremonial rhetoric connected to one particular performance. So those are the three different types of rhetoric that Aristotle breaks things down into. So we have political, which again, what should be done to achieve our goals and why. We have forensic, the justice or injustice of things that have happened. And we have ceremonial. Here is a thing that is worthy of emulation or worthy of critique. Thanks.